Long before the founding of the United States of America in the 2nd century BC, the mighty Middle Kingdom of China stood out as the sole superpower of the Far East. Foreign envoys from kingdoms far and wide traveled to kowtow before the emperor, offering tributes of gold, rare silks, and other exotic gifts. This ancient tributary system cemented China as the central fulcrum around which the known world appeared to orbit. But much has changed since this period. The world is far more interconnected, technologically advanced, and supposedly enlightened. Yet, at the heart of the world system, a similar tributary structure centers around the hegemonic power of the United States of America. This video explores how the twin pillars of this neo-tributary structure, the dollar's world reserve currency status and capital inflows, perpetuate the USA's hegemonic dominance over the rest of the world. We delve into the complex reasons why the US is seemingly able to run deficits running into the tens of trillions, while somehow only becoming stronger because of it. We also explore how the US has been able to weaponize this neo-tributary system and has used it to bring many nations under the thumb of the American economic empire. Join us today as we explore the complex web of America's hidden super-imperialism and how it has profoundly shaped the modern world. Throughout history, deficit spending was seen as something to be avoided at all costs, even for the mightiest of empires. Deficits are funded either by borrowing money, often from a foreign power, or through money creation. Historically, borrowing money often brought with it unwanted foreign influence, making it less than desirable. But deficits funded by money creation were no better, as it is recognized to be a major driver of inflation, as the increase in currency devalues the money in circulation. In extreme cases, this can lead to the kind of devastating hyperinflation experienced by Germany in the 1920s. Thus, states that fell into prolonged deficits lost not only their world power, but usually also their autonomy to manage their own domestic policies and retain ownership of their public resources and their central bank's financial policy. It should be noted that numerous economists contend that the decline in influence of both the Roman and British empires can be in part attributed to their sustained deficit spending. So will the same fate befall the United States of America? As this graph shows, the US government deficit as a percentage of GDP is quite considerable. As of making this video, the US debt stands at $33 trillion, equal to about 35% of global gross domestic product. However, America is no ordinary nation and maintains its hegemonic position not just despite its deficits, but because of them. This is thanks to the twin pillars of its neo-tributary system: the dollar's position as the world's reserve currency and capital inflows. The first, and more complex of these twin pillars, is the dollar's so-called exorbitant privilege of being the world's de facto reserve currency. According to the US government, 59% of all global central bank reserves in 2022 were denominated in US dollars, largely stemming from the fact that the dollar is required for a vast portion of global trade. The dollar is used in roughly 40% of international transactions, even though the US only accounts for 10% of global trade. This is because many countries choose to price their products in dollars. For example, both Thailand and South Korea set prices for over 80% of their trade in US dollars, despite only 20% of their trade being with the US. This means that anyone in the world wishing to buy a South Korean product, be that a new Hyundai or some BTS merch, will likely have to pay using dollars rather than with their own currency or South Korean won. The dominance of the dollar is further increased by the fundamental importance of many of the markets it is widely used in. For example, in the foreign exchange market, dollars are involved in nearly 90% of transactions. Another example is the oil trade, an economically vital market that is overwhelmingly priced internationally in US dollars. Through its oversized role in global trade, central banks are forced to buy and store dollars, making it the world's de facto reserve currency. This phenomenon can broadly be traced back to the end of the gold standard in the early 1970s. Under the Bretton Woods system, which arose out of the ashes of World War II, the exchange rate of most major currencies was fixed to the dollar. In turn, the dollar was pegged to the price of gold at $35 an ounce. Furthermore, the US promised to guarantee that any nation's dollar reserves would be directly convertible into gold. While the US was a surplus-producing nation, this system worked. However, in the 1960s and early 1970s, the US trade and budget deficit ballooned in large part because of the Vietnam War. As a result, European nations, particularly France, began protesting the Bretton Woods system as they believed the gold outflows led to an overvaluation of the dollar, giving the US an unfair advantage in the global system. Simultaneously, they also began making demands for US gold in exchange for their dollar reserves, with the French audaciously sending a naval destroyer to New York Harbor to make this demand. But rather than concede to a tighter fiscal policy, President Nixon ended the Bretton Woods system.
The strength of a nation's currency is based on the strength of that nation's economy. And the American economy is by far the strongest in the world. Accordingly, I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
Nixon's decision, which turned out not to be temporary, unshackled the US from the obligation to convert US dollars into gold, creating a fiat currency with a free floating exchange rate determined by the laws of supply and demand. With no need for gold reserves, deficits could, at least to a degree, simply be funded through creating more money. Ordinarily, this would induce inflation in the domestic economy as supply would outstrip demand, as the infamous cases of Weimar Germany and Zimbabwe show. Because of its near-omnipresent role as a world reserve currency, practically every time a financial transaction occurs in the world, be that in Australia, China, or Nigeria, demand for the US dollar rises. This elevated demand allows the US to increase the supply of dollars through money creation to a large extent without severely reducing the value of its currency. Furthermore, even if the supply of dollars outstrips global demand, therefore causing inflation, the US is not the only holder of its currency. As the vast majority of the world's governments and central banks hold a significant amount of US dollars, the inflationary effects of any dollar glut are dispersed across the globe, mitigating the effect of money creation on the domestic US economy. Thus, whether they like it or not, both developed and emerging economies are forced to finance the debts and deficits incurred by the US through additional money creation. So why do so many countries, both friend and foe, continue to use the dollar, 50 years on from the collapse of the Bretton Woods system? The reasons for the dollar's stranglehold on world trade are complex, but chiefly stem from the USA's perceived stability. Since World War II, the US has been the largest trading nation, the largest economy, and has had the most developed financial markets. Because of this powerful economic backing, the dollar is regarded as a safe investment compared to other currencies. Through this stability that the dollar provides, investors, capitalists, and governments can reduce the uncertainty created by fluctuations in exchange rates, which could undermine and devalue debts and investments. The USA's military might has also played a role in cementing the dollar as the world reserve currency. During the 1970s, the US forged a deepened relationship with OPEC and negotiated a series of agreements. The US agreed that it would provide military security to OPEC's oil fields, trade routes, and to the regimes that ruled them. In return, OPEC secretly agreed to continue to price oil using the US dollar. This birthed the petrodollar system, through which almost all oil-producing nations price their oil in US dollars. Furthermore, there are simply a lack of alternatives to the dollar, at least for now. Despite its economic size, lack of financial liberalization makes China's currency an unattractive world reserve currency. The euro is perhaps the only major currency which could compete with the dollar, although, as the Eurozone crisis underscored, this currency so far lacks the stability to fully replace the dollar. There are also a few potential unconventional threats to the US dollar, such as Bitcoin, good old-fashioned gold, as well as a hypothetical BRICS dollar, but we will discuss these in our next video. The second pillar of the neo-tributary system is less complex, although is of equal or perhaps greater importance. To a large extent, the US acts as the world's global surplus recycling mechanism, cultivating major capital inflows from surplus nations, mostly through the selling off of US treasuries. These capital inflows benefit the US in several profound ways. First, it allows the US to balance its trade deficit, therefore allowing the US to continue purchasing foreign goods. Furthermore, capital inflows also permit Wall Street to extend credit far further than it otherwise could. As discussed in more depth later on in the video, this has granted the US the ability to shackle developing nations in debt, aiding in the construction of the American economic empire. However, perhaps of greatest importance is that these capital inflows into US treasuries allow the US to further externally finance its budget deficit directly through debt to other nations. The reason these nations send their capital surpluses to the US is quite simple. Like the dollar, US treasuries are backed by the world's hegemon and are therefore deemed to be safe investments. One of the first examples of this phenomenon was the petrodollar. As well as the pricing of oil in dollars, the 1970s negotiations between the US and OPEC also resulted in an agreement which provided OPEC members, most notably Saudi Arabia, with easy access to US treasuries. This meant that OPEC could invest their vast oil surpluses into the secure investment provided by US treasuries, while allowing the US to continually fund its deficits. However, in the 21st century, this kind of external financing of the US deficit through the issuing of debt extends far beyond the petrodollar. Through its perceived low risk, US treasuries and other US investments act as a lightning rod for global capital. These capital inflows have resulted in the US bond market being by far the largest in the world, accounting for around 39% of the global total. Government-backed US treasuries used to finance the deficit make up the majority of this US debt market and are currently valued at $23 trillion. In conjunction with the dollar's world reserve currency status, this has unshackled the US from the normal laws of fiscal policy, allowing it to run up continuous and ever-growing budget deficits with no end in sight. It is often argued that the US deficits are money pits with no benefits to the US. However, at least in the short to medium term, this is just not true. The neo-tributary system afforded to the US by its economic hegemony permits it to further entrench its economic and military position in the world system through deficit spending. In this way, US hegemony begets US hegemony, allowing the status quo to remain the same. Perhaps the most obvious example of the US using its externally funded deficits to its advantage pertains to its military capabilities. According to the Congressional Budget Office, US defense spending in 2022 amounted to $751 billion out of a total discretionary spending budget of $1.7 trillion. High military spending has remained a constant part of the US federal budget, with this graph demonstrating that when adjusted for inflation, US military spending has remained consistently high throughout the post-war period, generally trending upward over time. Even in per capita terms, the US consistently outspends other world powers by a vast margin. Whether or not endless American wars further entrench US hegemony or simply creates more enemies is a matter of debate, and there's not enough time to talk about this vast topic in this video. However, what is certainly true is that defense spending allows the US to augment its technological development. Of particular note is DARPA's invention of the ARPANET, the precursor to the Internet. This branch of the US military is also credited with aiding in the development of many other technological breakthroughs such as desktop computing, supercomputing, global positioning systems, and robotics. With American state help, these technological advancements diffused into the academic and commercial spheres, further strengthening US dominance in the tech sector. The US deficit also allows for increases in spending on domestic programs, again further strengthening the USA's economic dominance. These domestic programs are vast and far-reaching, each affecting the US and world economy in a myriad of ways. The first examples we will briefly touch on today are education and infrastructure spending. Both of these can be seen as a kind of state investment in its economy, increasing worker productivity and earnings in the medium to long term. Unsurprisingly, the US invests colossal sums into its citizens' education and infrastructure. The federal budget allocated almost $638 billion for the Department of Education in 2022 alone. The USA spends similar amounts on its infrastructure. In 2017 alone, spending on water and transportation by US local, state, and federal governments cost $440 billion. Another noteworthy US investment into its domestic economy is the US Farm Bill, a long-standing package of legislation first implemented during the Great Depression. The scale of spending on these measures is profound, with the 2018 Farm Bill totaling over $1.4 trillion over a 10-year period. Although the Farm Bill's initial focus was the agricultural sector, it has grown to encompass other subsidy programs, such as nutrition assistance for financially deprived individuals, which now make up $1.2 trillion of this bill. As well as the humanitarian impact of not allowing its own low-income citizens to starve, the nutrition title of the Agriculture Bill also has noteworthy economic benefits, with a US Department of Agriculture study estimating that every dollar spent on this program generates an additional $0.8 to $1.5 in gross domestic product for the US economy. The agricultural assistance aspect of this bill also allows American farmers to remain competitive, contributing to the USA's leading role in global agricultural exports. The US government subsidizes farmers by around $230 per acre of cotton farmland, with some economists arguing that these US subsidies depress the global price of cotton by as much as 26%, preventing other nations in Latin America and Africa from competing in this market despite their lower production costs. However, this is highly beneficial to the US, allowing it to become by far the largest exporter of cotton in the world. As shown, spending by the US government on various military and domestic programs allows the USA to maintain technological dominance, increase worker productivity, reduce costs to businesses, and improve its global competitiveness in trade. This ultimately grants increased economic growth, continued US hegemony, and the strengthening of the neo-tributary system through perceived stability. But such vast spending on a myriad of financially beneficial programs would not be possible without externally financed budget deficits afforded by the neo-tributary system. Hypothetically, if the US could not externally finance its deficits and was forced to balance its budget, $14.6 trillion worth of spending would need to be cut between 2023 and 2032. As this graph from the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget shows, if taxes were not raised and spending was cut evenly across all US programs, a 26% average cut per program would be required. If expenditure deemed essential remained untouched, cuts as deep as 85% would be required in other programs. Thus, it becomes clear that without the unique monetary abilities garnered through the dollar's exorbitant privilege and the surge of foreign capital into US treasuries, the USA would be far less economically powerful and prosperous than it currently is in the modern era. So far in this video, I have broadly argued that the US uses the American neo-tributary system to augment its own economic, technological, and military superiority through externally funded deficit spending. Yet, the most substantial ability afforded to the US by this system is that it allows the US to deploy a kind of monetary superweapon against the rest of the world. The great inflation of the 1970s saw one of the most dramatic price increases since the American Civil War. There are a plethora of reasons as to why inflation got so high, with old-school economists often citing rising oil prices in the wake of the OPEC oil embargo as the primary reason. But this non-monetary view of inflation is now outdated and arguably a deflection from the fact this inflation was manufactured, perhaps deliberately, perhaps not, by the US. In 2022, even the Federal Reserve Board itself concluded that this focus on inflation as a non-monetary problem caused by rising oil prices was erroneous and exacerbated inflation during the 1970s. Despite high inflation, the Federal Reserve maintained relatively low interest rates, with the amount of money in circulation more than doubling over the course of the decade. But due to the dollar's role as the world reserve currency, it was not only the US that was affected by this policy. As noted earlier on in the video, foreign nations are forced to keep significant amounts of dollars in their treasuries for trade, and because it is regarded as a safe investment. Economists have debated for a long time exactly how much of the USA's currency is actually overseas. Some estimates put it as low as 25%, whilst others put it as high as 65%. But regardless, it is still a significant amount, meaning that the inflationary effects of money creation in its various forms do not simply stay in the US and are dissipated across the globe. In the 1970s, the Federal Reserve's loose monetary policies were compounded by Nixon's decision to remove all controls on US capital outflows by 1974. This helped the US to export the dollar glut accumulated through its deficit spending to the rest of the world, helping to further push up the prices of most commodities worldwide. At the end of the Bretton Woods system in 1971, the average price for a bushel of wheat was $1.57. But by 1980, the average price had risen to $4.57. Other staple goods like corn saw similar increases over this period, rising from $1.37 to $3.57 per bushel. Even larger price inflation could be seen with other important commodities such as gold. In 1971, the average closing price of gold was around $40 per ounce, but by 1980, the average closing price of gold had rocketed to over $600. Because of these major increases in prices for raw resources, overall consumer prices skyrocketed, with poorer countries being most adversely affected. For instance, Bolivia saw an average annual price inflation of over 20% between 1971 and 1980. The Democratic Republic of Congo was hit even more severely during this period, with annual inflation averaging at around 44%. Thus, through its status as the world's reserve currency and money creation, the US was, at least to a degree, getting the rest of the world to pay for the various deficit-fueled federal programs which benefited its domestic economy. Yet, the significance of the 1970s Great Inflation does not end there. This global inflation collided with some other interlinked phenomena to create a deadly economic cocktail which would profoundly impact the global economy and further benefit the US. The first of these was the low US interest rates, which helped cause, or at the very least exacerbate, inflation in the first place. The second was a massive influx of capital into European and American banks and treasuries. Much of this deposited currency was OPEC petrodollars, as revenues had skyrocketed because of the increased price of oil. Another vast portion of deposited wealth came from global investors in surplus-producing nations such as Germany, who sought safe investments within the US. The third phenomenon was the dire state of many poorer countries' finances due to the global inflation wreaking havoc upon their economies. Combined, this created ripe conditions for banks to recycle their dollar glut, using enticing low-interest loans to developing nations that were struggling with the US-induced inflation. Despite the high risk that these banks were taking by giving out these loans, few in the US government seemed to care. President Ford's former economic counselor later remarked that the entire Ford administration including me, told the large banks that the process of recycling petrodollars to the less developed countries was beneficial and perhaps a patriotic duty. Thus, throughout the 1970s, these loans were extended far and wide, both to countries in the developing world and even to Soviet satellite states. However, although in the short term these loans may have been of some benefit, they were a Trojan horse time bomb, and in the long term, these loans would cause irrevocable damage to these nations. After entrapping many developing nations in low-interest debt, the US raised interest rates to tackle inflation at the end of the 1970s, in what Paul Volcker, the president of the Federal Reserve, infamously described as the controlled disintegration of the world economy. Thus, from 1977 until 1981, the US lending interest rate rose from 6.8% to 18.9%. Largely because of these spiking US interest rates, the developing world began defaulting on their large debts they had accumulated. By the end of 1982, almost 40 nations were in arrears, and a year later, 27 countries were forced to renegotiate the terms of their loans. In the Soviet Union satellite states, there was great anger that they had fallen for what they perceived to be the capitalists' trap. Communist states such as Poland were forced to enact strict austerity measures, which exacerbated the political unrest that ultimately resulted in the fall of the Soviet Union. In the developing world, Soviet influence was further diminished by the Western reaction to the Third World debt crisis. Rather than allow these banks to suffer the consequences of lending out risky loans, Western governments ensured these banks would get their money from indebted nations by simply lending out more loans. Only this time, these loans would come under the strict conditionalities of the World Bank and IMF, which would force these economies into a new kind of neoliberal and global capitalism, which revolved around the US. The IMF claims that these SAPs are aimed at helping countries solve balance of payments problems without resorting to measures that harm national or international prosperity. But these SAPs have come under extreme scrutiny from both the libertarian right and the left. Perhaps the largest criticism of these SAPs was that they forced countries into free trade deals before they were ready to compete on the global market. For instance, after a 40% reduction in tariffs in the Ivory Coast, the shoe, chemical, textile and automobile industries collapsed after facing international competition from developed nations. Similarly, after implementing free trade policies in Zimbabwe, the unemployment rate rose from 10% to 20%. There were also other negative impacts to this enforced free trade. In countries where tax collection infrastructure is not fully developed, tariffs can account for as much as 50% of a government's tax revenue, meaning free trade deprives them of a valuable source of revenue. Some, such as Paul Collier, have argued that increased competition with developed countries discourages investment in value-added advanced sectors, instead promoting the implementation of resource extraction as the primary mechanism of achieving economic growth. This makes these countries highly vulnerable to resource price shocks, dependent on manufacturing nations, and can lead to what is known as Dutch disease, a phenomena we'll be exploring in depth very soon in a future video. According to one study, this SAP-mandated free trade, as well as SAP-mandated financial regulation, has contributed to capital flight from these nations. The sheer scale of this problem is immense. A 2015 study by Global Financial Integrity estimated that since 1980, developing countries have lost a cumulative $16.3 trillion through capital flight. It must be noted that this figure is likely understated, as elites and companies often report fake prices on their trade invoices to further extract money from developing countries. Known as trade misinvoicing, this practice further compounds the capital outflow from developing countries, with some estimates putting it as high as $875 billion per year. The SAPs also forced through a series of neoliberal reforms within the countries themselves, requiring these nations to privatize public assets. According to the World Bank, it alone has privatized over $2 trillion worth of public assets in the developing world, much of which has been bought up by Western companies at bargain prices. The profitability of this endeavor for the US is evidenced by the tremendous increase in profits derived from American foreign investments in the wake of the Third World Debt Crisis. In the late 1970s, US foreign investments were valued at only about 20% of domestic profits, but after the structural adjustment programs had been put in place during the 1980s, this figure rose dramatically, with foreign investments equating to 80% of domestic profits by the end of the decade. However, while the US and its allies have developed a profitable overseas portfolio through these SAPs, they have had devastating impacts on communities in the Global South. The most prominent example is the Cochabamba water war. In line with their neoliberal outlook, the IMF proposed the full privatization of the Cochabamba Valley's water supply, granting the uncontested bidder, Bechtel, a monopoly over this public asset. Water rates were subsequently raised by this US company by over 100%, and even the third of the population that were not connected to the water supply were billed. Unsurprisingly, mass discontent and violent unrest followed to protest this decision. The loans themselves also contribute significantly to extracting wealth from the developing world. Since the Third World Debt Crisis began in 1980, the Global South has spent $13 trillion servicing their debts. Of the $13 trillion so far paid by the Global South to service these debts, $4.2 trillion can be attributed to the interest incurred on these loans. Some countries have been more adversely affected by the servicing of such loans, with some, such as Lebanon, spending over 52% of its government budget servicing its debts each year. Furthermore, these developing nations are often not allowed to spend it on what they would like, even if it would make more economic sense. This is because of the implementation of tied aid, a type of agreement that is included in about 58% of all bilateral aid. These kinds of agreements require the recipient countries to construct large projects using creditor nations' materials and contractors. These tied aid requirements are implemented despite the fact that domestic labor and materials would circulate money back into the developing nation's economy, whilst also being up to 30% cheaper. This is, of course, very beneficial for countries like the US, whose businesses get back 82 cents per dollar invested into World Bank loans. All of these previously discussed examples deprive developing countries of vital capital, resources, and finances, while at the same time benefiting American and Western corporations. This prevents much of the developing world from ever reaching economic parity with the West, in of itself a major driver of inequality. The relative lack of development in developing countries means that they are paid less for their goods and services. But if the so-called Global South had been paid Western prices between the years of 1990 and 2015, some estimate they would have garnered an additional $242 trillion. Although its workings are poorly understood by the general public, this neo-tributary system is arguably the most powerful weapon of the US. Its far-reaching use within the global economy grants the US a kind of economic superpower through which it can impress its economic dominance on other states and augment its already colossal might. As we've explored in this video, the dollar's role as the reserve currency and the vast amounts of wealth that are directed toward the US allow it to run up never-ending deficits, which help fund its continued military, technological, and economic dominance. Furthermore, the US neo-tributary system can be weaponized through the export of inflation and the recycling of its vast capital inflows in the form of developing world debt. As we've explored, this debt entrapment can then be further used to extract concessions which aid American corporations and perpetuate global inequality. But processes similar to those present during the Great Inflation of the 1970s and the Third World Debt Crises of the 1980s are underway in the present. Mirroring the 1970s, loose monetary policy from the Fed has resulted in a staggering amount of money creation, arguably leading to the high inflation rates seen in much of the West at the present time. Furthermore, US interest rate hikes and a strong dollar are threatening to bankrupt developing nations yet again, in a process highly reminiscent of the 1980s Third World Debt Crisis. But although there are stark similarities, there are also many differences. Notably, the neo-tributary system now faces the largest threat in its history. One pillar of the neo-tributary system, capital inflows, is being shaken both from within the US itself and from the outside. US treasuries may no longer be as enticing as they once were, leading to downgrades of its credit rating by ratings agencies like Fitch. The reasons cited for this downgrade include political polarization and a general erosion of governance. Furthermore, geopolitical tensions, such as US support for Taiwan, have prompted US adversaries like China to sell off over 10% of their US treasuries in 2022 alone. Potentially, this geopolitical turmoil and ratings downgrade could reduce demand for US treasuries in the future and reduce capital inflows. This geopolitical tension is also threatening the stability of the US dollar as the world reserve currency. Unsurprisingly, Vladimir Putin has called for the use of national currencies in trade instead of the US dollar. But perhaps more worryingly, other BRICS nations with more friendly ties to the US have joined his call. In April 2023, President Lula of Brazil drew a large applause from Chinese and Brazilian dignitaries after stating, "Every night I ask myself why all countries have to base their trade on the dollar." Even Saudi Arabia, who for decades priced oil in dollars in exchange for US protection, has recently started accepting Chinese yuan instead of dollars for Chinese oil sales. Quite clearly, the twin pillars of the American neo-tributary system are under increased threat from both internal and external forces. To find out about the threats to this system and how it might radically shape the lives of ordinary Americans, make sure to subscribe for an upcoming video on this topic. And if you wish to find out the myriad of complex reasons behind the West's initial rise to power, check out this video.